Welcome to the Creative Academy, your go-to source for accountability, coaching, and community. I'm Donna Barker, and today I'm talking to Amanda Bidnall about researching for fiction and researching for nonfiction, and some of the tricky places. I will say that I get stuck in what I love to call procrasti-searching, because honestly, I love research. I love writing, but I love research maybe even more. So Amanda, why don't you introduce yourself and let us know what kind of writing you've done that has required research?
All right. Well, yes, my name is Amanda. I'm a freelance editor and writer, but my educational background is actually academic history. So I received my PhD in 2010 in modern British history and the history of the British Empire. So all of my research experience up until recently had to do with that kind of intense archival and secondary research for academic writing. For all three of my degrees and my PhD dissertation, I did revise and turn into a nonfiction book, which was released last year in 2017 by Liverpool University Press, and it's called The West Indian Generation. However, in the last few years, I have also begun in my spare time, how we all have, I do write fiction, romantic fiction, including one draft of a story I wrote that was a historical romance set in 1961 in England, which, according to some people, isn't even a historical novel. But I did have to do historical research just like you would do for any other book, historical or contemporary.
So, okay, so you say like any other book. Now, you're also a professor, correct, at a university?
Well, no, actually, I'm not teaching anymore.
Oh,
I
you're not
did
teaching anymore.
leave,
Okay.
but I did teach at university at Simon Fraser University for about 8 years.
Okay.
So, yes, I have
All
that.
right. So I was just thinking, in terms of research, you've done both, and now you're a kick-ass developmental editor, which means you're acknowledging and finding places also where writers aren't maybe able to do a little bit better research in their work. But what would you say the differences between researching for fiction and researching for nonfiction books is?
Yeah, there is a difference. And I didn't really realize it until I tried writing historical fiction for myself because I was thinking, no problem. I've done all kinds of historical research. This is my period. It shouldn't be a big deal. And then I found like almost every paragraph, there was something I didn't know. Um, what kind of shoes would somebody of this class wear for a night out at the pub if they were in rural England? Things like that. Really, when you're doing nonfiction research, often you are very mindful, and a lot of your research has to do with the big picture, the big historical context, whether it's class relations or race or identity, national identity, or geopolitics. And even if you are studying your small little compartment of that history, you are trained to always be aware and always be tying that small thing to the big picture. So a lot of your research has to do with that, um, which is great. And it's great to do that research for fiction as well. It just adds, it's good. It's good. You need your protagonist to be operating within a world that makes historical sense. I had my protagonist be one corner of a love triangle between an upper class British man and a sort of self-made American man, which reflects the geopolitical situation at the time where Britain's world power is fading and America's is rising. So you can do neat things like that. But for fiction, it's all about the intimate details. It's all
Mm-hmm.
about what they're wearing, how they're doing their hair, what their houses are like,
The
what kind
words
of,
they use, maybe?
yes, absolutely, the kind of language they use, and also just their mentality. What is
Right.
their mentality about things? That's really hard to get at, and I think in some ways it's a lot harder to get at. So that kind of research for fiction is, I don't know, it takes a little digging. I think it takes a little. You have to make some not obvious choices.
Okay, so that makes me think of something. I recently saw George R. Martin, the
Mhm.
author of that, the Game of
Yeah.
Thrones. What is it called? I mean, it's the oeuvre. Uh,
Yes.
he was being raked over the coals by some readers, or perhaps they were people who were watching the show, saying that the sex scenes in Game of Thrones were gratuitous because there was so much non-consensual sex, aka rape, going
Right.
on. And he argued back that that was the way it happened at that time, which is really interesting. So it's fiction, and yet there is a period that it's taking place in. And I guess, so I'm curious to know, in your experience, or just from your advice, what would you say if somebody has got a book set in a period where something takes place that is the norm of the time, that is really distasteful to the norm of our time?
Yeah.
How do you handle that?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. And it is I haven't read the Game of Thrones books. I haven't even seen the show. I'm the one person in the world who hasn't seen it. However, it is very interesting because George R. R. Martin is talking about about historic context, which is all fine and good, but Game of Thrones is a fantasy. It's a fantasy world. It's a make believe world. So he is still making choices about what. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he really has it set in a certain century or a certain 50-year span, and he just adds dragons. Maybe that's what he does. But he is still making choices about what that world is like. I'll set that to the side.
Okay.
However, it was fascinating to me. Um, it is really interesting when you're writing fiction. And someone said this to me a long time ago, or I read it. I think I read it somewhere, and I wish I knew who it was. And they said, in historical fiction, everything has to be scrupulously accurate and true to the time and true to the historical context, except for the attitude of the protagonist.
Oh, how interesting.
Very interesting, because readers like modern thinking protagonists. So, I mean, think of how many historical
Ah,
novels you've read that have a hero who is sort of out of time, who is more progressive than everyone else around them. And oftentimes, the secondary characters are almost there to illustrate what most people thought, to illustrate those norms of the time. But the protagonist is always breaking out of those norms. They're always doing something different. So,
that
so
is
yeah,
so interesting.
yeah. So with and that's a choice that fiction writers make. They make their characters, their main characters, often a little bit ahead of their time. Um,
Interesting.
the
And
thing,
I guess that's so we can relate to them, right? Because
yes,
that's,
so we can relate to them. I mean, and to take it back to the rape example with Game of Thrones, um, what if you read a novel that was set in medieval times and the heroine um, got raped, violently raped, but what if she had a completely different attitude to it than the rest of us? What if she um, thought that it was her fault, that she had done something wrong, that she deserved it, that she was scandalous and she was different, and therefore she was getting punished, um, because God willed it. I mean,
mhm,
most readers would be like, "What? No way!" And yet, that perspective might actually be more historically consistent. The thing
and
with George R. R. Martin, though, is that with rape and non-consensual sex, you have to be really careful, because you do have to finesse it, because he still might be sensationalizing it. If non-consensual sex really was more of a norm in whatever historical period his story is set in, then
mhm,
someone writing about it at the time maybe wouldn't sensationalize it at all.
right.
In which case, maybe that's what's jarring to readers or viewers, that it's presented more sensationalistically than what seems authentic.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So are there other topics that writers you think need to be careful of? I mean, maybe that's an obvious question, but and maybe you've already answered this. So issues that we want to represent historically accurately and can be those subjects that are really tricky for readers to grapple with and may not even want to read. Like, does it make sense maybe to leave sections out of a history that we don't want to be dealing with? Or do you think that that detracts from the authenticity of the story? Or maybe
I
it's
think
a case by case.
it can, but again, that's a choice the writer has to make. Is that non-consensual sex scene, is that essential to the story?
Mhm.
Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe the writer wants to make a point for readers, wants to make a historical point, wants to make and to illustrate a time, in which case that can seem very authentic. I always think back to what Diana Gabaldon did in the Outlander series when it comes to beating children and wives, because Claire, who conveniently is from the 1940s, has an argument with Jamie, who's from the 18th century, about whether it's okay to beat your children as punishment. And she thinks it's terrible.
Right.
But then we get his perspective, which is more historical, which is that everyone gets beat when they're kids and they get in trouble. That's what you do. You're going to get beat for it. So you just see it as punishment for, fair punishment for whatever transgression you committed. So in that case, she used it as an opportunity to kind of air that debate.
Make a social comment, maybe even
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I know for myself, I'm working on my current nonfiction book, which is the second shot at doing this. And I don't have a very clear sense of when I should stop researching and do the hard work of writing, in part because I love the research.
Mhm.
So have you got, like, with your own PhD? So I'm thinking, PhD is comparable in length to a novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How did you know when to stop research and just start to write?
You don't really know, but when I was doing my master's, actually, I was busily doing research, and you think, this is good research, I've got to do it, I'm helping my story. And then my advisor at the time said very slyly, he just said, some people use research as a procrastination technique, right?
Never heard of it. Never.
But yes, exactly, which is what you were just talking about. And it's like, right. And part of me thinks that you should almost start writing right away.
Interesting.
I mean, you have to do enough so that you have your bearings, whatever it is you're talking about. You have to have your bearings. But oftentimes, people are writing about something they're already interested in. So maybe they've already got their bearings on that subject. You're going to be doing research throughout the entire writing process, and you're going to keep doing research after you're done. It never, ever ends. You can never complete research, which is one of the frustrating things about it. There's always more research to do. So you should just start writing.
Okay.
Maybe you have to go back and change a few things. You might have to go back and change a few things, but you are going to waste much less time by just diving in and doing the research as you go. Maybe that's a controversial.
No, I mean, it could be controversial, but I mean, I think that's the advice that I personally need to hear right now, is just like, start writing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so another question. With stories that require more research than just, how long is Yonge Street and how long would it take to walk that distance? So for instance, with a nonfiction or with something that truly is historical, set in a period that we're not really familiar with, there's a lot, like you can have hundreds of pages of documents or hundreds of documents that you've sourced. How do you keep them all straight so that you know where to go easily and quickly to find the information that you remember you have, but you're not sure what the actual answer is?
I'm probably, by today's standard, old-fashioned. I feel like when I when I was in university, even when I was doing my PhD, I feel like automatic referencing software was just getting going.
What is automatic referencing
Well, there's
software?
there's citation, there's software that you can use that will do all your citations for you, like EndNote and RefWorks, and they basically organize your references. That's what it does.
Wow.
Not always very well, but it does help if you have a great huge number of references and you have to document those references in a certain way. but I am old-fashioned in the sense I feel like you have to kind of you've got to do the grunt work, and it does pay off in the long run. So for my dissertation and my book, for every document that I read or analyzed, I just made a Word document, and that document had the title and publication information, that I would write
Hmm.
down right away. It would have the thesis and summary. So a thesis of the book. This,
Hmm.
through two sentences, this is what the writer is trying to say or do. And then maybe a summary of the most important points from my perspective. Then I'll have a section on, I also have a section, I'll put it in a subject category. So usually once you start to do some research, it'll be pretty clear what category. I had a chapter on social conditions in Britain after 1945, and I had a chapter on fine art, and I had a chapter on theater.
This is for your fiction book. This is for your
No,
novel,
this is for my nonfiction book.
your thesis. Okay.
Yes, this
Oh
for
yeah,
yeah,
which is also
and my book. Yeah.
yeah. Your book.
And then I have a section that's quotes, and I will actually pick a handful of quotes from a book or an article, and I will type it out or cut and paste it. And I will have the actual quote in there, and probably people would think that's a huge waste of time. But when it comes to, but it isn't, for two reasons. One is that oftentimes you will use direct quotes um, in your writing, and then it's right there. You don't have to go find that source again. It's also good because when you write something down yourself, you remember it better. You
Yeah,
just do.
you just do.
You write it down, you remember it better, and then you will remember it, and you'll think, "Oh, there was that quote. There was that quote in that book that was really relevant to this paragraph I'm writing right now." And so I'm going to go back. I'm really against writing in the margin, doing sticky
Oh, I was
notes.
going to ask you.
No,
Do you
don't do
mark up your
sticky notes.
books?
If you can do if you write in the margin, you highlight, you do sticky notes. You photocopy pages out of a book because they're important pages. I still do those things sometimes, but you will not remember. You will not remember it. You won't remember, and then you'll have to return that book to the library. Or you'll put it on the shelf, and then you might as well have not written those little notes in the margin at all. You have to put it in a document, and you have to have all those documents in one place.
And then they're searchable. I mean, that answers part of the question right there.
That's right.
See, I'm
And
doing
then,
it all wrong. You should see my poor books.
well,
Um,
it's taken years and for my book, there was this joke that I had come across, a joke that people told about immigration, and it was a really illustrative joke, and I couldn't find it. So I couldn't really reference it properly because I had no idea where I found that joke, and it's a
yeah.
shame.
So what authors do you admire with respect to having done great research in either fiction or nonfiction writing?
Um, there's so many, but I read the novel Small Island by Andrea Levy, and that was a novel, but it was about West Indian immigration to London after the war. So I was reading it from the perspective of someone who had done all kinds of research on the topic. I could have easily poked holes in her account, but she did such a good job of, I think I mentioned this earlier, capturing the mentality, the qualitative things that you can't easily put your finger on. There was a scene where the main heroine of the story, who is from Jamaica, I believe, she goes to the bakery, and she's just disgusted with the English because the baker takes the loaf of bread off the shelf with his bare hands, gives it to the customer, who with their bare hands puts it in their bag. No, and from her, she's like, that's so unclean. And then there's like a home delivery, and there's a home birth, and they use a bowl to catch the afterbirth. And then in her back of her mind, she's thinking they're probably going to use that bowl later. So when they're making dinner, she's so disgusted. And I'm like, that's a hard thing. That author obviously must have talked to a lot of real people, you can't find that stuff in every book that you read. And yet she did such a great job of bringing that to life.
That's fabulous. And that actually speaks to, pre-answers almost the question that I wanted to ask you next, which is, as an editor, what have you seen writers do well, and and the flip side is, where can writers do better with their research to bring stories to life? Like, what is the easy place that we can go to add that extra detail to make stories, just bring them to life more?
Yeah, I mean, as an editor, you do have to trust the writer. I may be a historian, but I'm familiar with my one tiny corner of history. Most anything that's required research, most of the say nonfiction novels, or even the academic nonfiction work that I've edited, I have to trust that it's mostly correct. I can't go fact checking that.
But in terms of good story, whether we're writing fiction or
Right,
nonfiction, we
right.
really want to keep people
Mhm,
captivated. So,
mhm, mhm.
uh, using research, how does that? Where can we learn to be better? To
Right. I would say a couple of things. One would be, like I said, to get at that everyday domestic stuff. And Diana Gabaldon is actually really good at that. Like she'll have, some people don't like this, but I love reading like descriptions of medical, medical procedures, performed in the 18th century, or looking at women working with wool in the countryside. That stuff is great. Um, and yeah, and trying to get at a difference in attitude. I find one thing that can be a real dead giveaway and can really pull you out of a story is when dialogue is not done very
mm,
effectively, whether it's a person from a different social class or whether it's a person with a different accent. That's a hard thing sometimes to. I mean, I was just watching the new Anne series on Netflix,
mhm.
and at one point, one of the characters goes, "Hey, buddy, hey, like, how's it going?" He said something like that, and I'm thinking, I don't think they would have said that,
Uh,
in 1910. Maybe someone would have, but it did pull me out of the story.
right.
That kind of
And
stuff can really turn a reader off really fast.
yeah, and if for folks who aren't writing historicals, I can see that making sure that your characters are speaking in the language that they would in their profession or with their educational background
Absolutely.
would, or for their age. That's an interesting one, is how to write, in a voice that a child would write in, I guess, or that
Yes.
or would speak in.
Yes, yes. Or for example, writing fiction and writing dialogue without using any contractions.
Yeah,
Most people speak in contractions.
most
Um,
people.
so sometimes I will add those in just to make something sound more naturalistic. But I mean, in some cases, you know, with a certain kind of character, that might be a great way to differentiate.
Mm.
But for the most part, things like that, or trying to show an accent by changing the phonetic spell, making the
Okay,
spelling.
so how is the best way to show an accent then?
I don't know if there is a best way, but I think the best way is just to hint at it. Like one thing, I mean, people say this, which is pick one or two words that person will say in that accent where you actually spell the word differently, but keep all the rest the same. You or even just to actually put in a line that says, "Oh, he said this word with a certain kind of drawl," or just enough to plant the seed in the reader's brain so that they can do the work and that imagine that dialogue is being spoken differently,
Right,
like
right.
Hagrid in Harry Potter.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm thinking it's funny as you were saying that. I was thinking from my raising background in Quebec, how the French, they put that H in the wrong place and they don't put the H where you need it.
That's
Uh,
right.
so I could just totally see, if I've got a French character, I'll be putting H's in the wrong places
Mhm.
and taking them out where they should be. It is not good else for me today. And
And it can very easily be overdone and almost seem like a caricature, which you don't want that either. So again, it's a
that's the truth. Yes.
fine balance.
Um, Okay, so any last tips that you've got for researching, doing it well and not doing it too much, so that we just use it as a tool, not to start writing?
um I would say don't depend on what's already out there as your frame of reference. I see this in historical romance, like Victorian um, Regency romances, where there seems to be there's this literary picture of what that world is like, and then every book replicates it. And I feel like it's not actually always true to what that world was actually like, but everyone keeps like I've read a lot of 19th century history and I've read a lot of Victorian novels, and not once have I come across the phrase the ton. And that's mentioned in every historical romance. Oh, the ton. I had never heard that word before I started reading historical romances.
What does
I'm
it
sure
mean?
it was
I have
mentioned.
no idea what it means.
It's a reference to the upper echelons of polite society. So it's sometimes referred to as the upper 10,000 or something like that. And I'm sure someone might come back and say, actually, I read a book and they do mention it. And I'm sure it was mentioned at the time, but it certainly wasn't as ubiquitous as it seems to be in these books that I read. So, branch out and find those really human stories. Use those memories that people have. Use those attitudes that you see written in letters or diaries.
What a great idea. Research letters and
Yeah,
diaries. Yeah.
so much of this stuff is digitized now too. I mean, if you have any connection to a university library, not only do they have loads of digital databases with this stuff, but they have dedicated people who are there to help you research a subject. So if you do have any kind of in with the university and you can talk to one of those people, they can tell you what databases to look at, what parts of the library to go to. Browse the stacks. Don't just get your book off the shelf and go. Look at all the other books around it on the bookshelves, because you'll find all kinds of other stuff that you didn't find when you did a search in the catalog.
Right. Wonderful. Amanda, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
It was so much fun. And it's time for me to start writing, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Put down the book.
Put down. You should say I bought a brand new bookshelf to house all of the books I have purchased from the thrift store on my subject. So, yeah,
They're right there if you ever need them.
They're
but you
right
can
there.
write in the meantime.
Writing. Okay, thanks so much for taking time with us today, and we will see you over in the Creative Academy. That is Amanda Bidnall. For anyone who is looking for an editor, a developmental editor, or a copy editor, she's one of our go-tos. Yeah, she's one. Okay,
take care.
Bye. Are you a member of the Creative Academy yet? Join us today and unlock a wealth of resources, masterclasses, feedback opportunities, and community events designed to help you reach the next step in your writing journey. No matter what stage you're at, we've got a helping hand to guide you along the way. Check out our free resource room if you'd like to get a taste of how we can help you reach your writing and publishing goals. Thank you for bringing us along on your writing and publishing journey. Crystal, Eileen, and I hope to see you around the Creative Academy soon.